Sergeant Daniel Kanipe of the U.S. Army served with the 7th Cavalry Regiment on June 25, 1876. He was one of the few individuals who survived the Battle of Little Bighorn and was a key player in the conflict. He provided Company George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry during the court of inquiry into the conflict. After the war, Kanipe remained in the Army, giving crucial testimony on the activities of lieutenant and later writing a memoir about his experiences at Little Bighorn. We started on what would turn out to be a most regrettable trip on May 17, 1876. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more in-depth historical explorations. We set up camp at the Big Heart River after marching 12 miles there. We spent some time observing our surroundings. We continued up to the Powder River around June 10th. His narrative, The Kanipe Story, is considered a crucial historical source for comprehending the support our community by liking and subscribing to our channel. 6 of the 12 units were sent on a reconnaissance mission. Following General Reno, the command of the detachment, we boarded pack mules, turned back down the Rosebud River, brewed more coffee in the morning, and resumed our march until midday along the route. We then turned toward the Tongue River, made some coffee before it began to fall, and spent the entire night walking the trail during the 2-day journey up the river. The Indian Trail was then found along the Rosebud Rivers, with 10 days' worth of provisions after we left the wagon train at the Powder River and realized we were running low on 10 days. We encountered the remaining 6 companies under the command of the general. This was allegedly due to his stance against the post merchants who had received under President Grant's administration. It was impossible to buy anything from the post concessions at these various posts without first obtaining it from those vendors. A glass of alcohol cost 25 cents, and General Terry was present. They had arrested General Custer at the confluence of the Rosebud and Yellowstone. The department commander and the servings were typically relatively small amounts of whiskey. Custer was arrested for setting a maximum price. Nevertheless, he was accompanied by other senior Army commanders and given a command at the location without them. In hindsight, we view this as a mistake because the Indians would not have stopped running if he had taken 2 Gatling guns and 2 Gatling guns from the steamship Far West. He surrendered them to the indicated. On July the 22nd, Custer's group received 15 days' worth of food from the steamship Far West on the General Gibbon, who transported them across the river because he thought they could get by without a doubt. They would still be running, and I wouldn't have been the only survivor if we had a Gatling gun there. We broke camp and began moving all day on June 22nd. Custer ordered those directions to be. After marching until almost dusk, we set up camp and resumed the next morning, June 24th. On that day, we arrived at the data location where the Indians had performed a wardance, in addition to having enough fire to make coffee. Webagana started anew on the morning of June 23rd. They gave hand signals that night that there would be no more bugle sounds and that there would be a Sundance. Because of their dancing, the ground was firm and smooth, and they had built brush huts out of cottonwood trees. 6 Crow Indian scouts who were part of 4 contingents found a white man's calf. It came from a soldier under Gibbon's command. Those Indians who hated the hunt were thrilled to see a Sioux hanging from a willow twig. They gave the calf back to General Custer, who looked it over before giving it to the men. They usually broke up, shouting, dancing, and yelling. What were they looking for? I would have in the middle pockets of my company's Soderstein sergeant, Sergeant Finley, at the time of his death. On June 24th, we marched. The Indian scouts who had been deployed earlier returned at around 10 o'clock that evening. It was dark back then, and you can see enough to read at 9 o'clock in the summertime there. That evening, we were to pack our gear and saddle up. We marched through the regiment, which was led by General Custer, to a gully that seemed to be a suitable location for us to spend the night, approaching the point where the Little Bighorn and Rosebud rivers converge. The remainder were hidden for as long as we wanted. However, when we entered the Data Hard Trot and Gallop, Quartermaster Sergeant Hurst dropped some hard bread from the pack train's packs. General Custer gave these sergeants instructions to return and collect the bread after learning of this, and 2 Indians were assisting themselves to the bread. We stopped after marching up the divide. General Custer was assigned to lead Henry Voss, the head trumpeter, and he split his group into 3 detachments upon his return. General Custer left for 2 hours with 2 scouts and the pack train with Troop B, while Captain Bentayen was given the troops H, K, and D. When they noticed the approaching army, they fled. He told General Custer about the incident to act now and surprise the Indians the following morning, but because they were aware of his presence, he chose to return to camp and gave us the order to add up. I assumed he intended to C, E, I, and F were held by Custer for himself. We moved out after leaving the location. We ran down what is now Benin's Creek until we reached a crossing, where we found it obvious that 3 different angles would be used to attack the Indian camp. The pack train was an abandoned Indian camp that was smoking fires, and one of the surviving teepees contained a deceased Indian. Major Reno was positioned to the left of General Custer with Captain Benin on his left. Captain McDougal was supposed to lead up the main Indian trail. When Major Reno showed up, General Custer ordered him to burn the teepee. He followed orders to cross Benin's Creek and the Little Bighorn met. I told First Sergeant Bobot that when we were within a quarter of a mile of the Indians, I saw them on top of the bluffs overlooking the river. General Custer looked down at that point, and Troops C, I, and F made our way to the bluffs where the Indians had been spotted. Tom Custer, the general's brother, was the commander of my Troop C. Although it was difficult, Rior Urukara, Curly, a Crow, and Chief Scout Mitch Buey stayed on the bluffs with us. We galloped to the far end of the bluffs so that we could attack the Indian camp after the men of kilometers in all directions. Our group's Crow Indian scouts intended to sneak down and seize a few of them, made an attempt to slip down, but they were shot for it. By the time we reached the summit, the Indians had vanished, but the teepees were visible for a couple of horses. Those 4 companies began yelling and hollering when they spotted it down in the valley. Both of us were approaching Captain Tom Custer when Sergeant Fennell was riding near me. He cried at him that he was reaching his breaking point, and I repeated the call. "If you can, come on, Finn." Though I initially thought it was a bad pack train to transmit orders that General Custer had just given, I made my way back. The captain then told me to turn around and locate McDougal and the McDouga to move the pack train directly to the high ground. A large Indian camp is present. He said, "Tell you should not stop to fix the packs if they come loose. Slice them off. Act quickly." In the end, I saved my life. If General Custer's last words had come back to me, Sergeant Fennell would have received the orders, and I wouldn't be telling this story. We all rode in silence and gave the soldiers a few minutes' notice before they fell back. I could see the dust rising from the pack train and made my way toward that. I gave 3 cheers as my group, and the others continued down into the Indian camp. Some of them galloped past General Custer, unable to control their horses. "Hold your horses, boys," they yelled at them. "There are plenty down there." I rode back after they continued. Major Renoas was everywhere, so after giving the orders to Captain McDougal at the pack train, I went to Captain Bentayen because I had been told to present them to him as well. Before we could save them, the Indians would lean on the manskap. As Dr. DeWolf retreated from the base of the bluffs, McDougal and his men rode up to the top of the hill to support him. Behind them, the Indians were shooting, and men were dropping, and he was killed. He would have been spared if he had advanced only a few paces. I saw some Indians hurrying along as I followed Captain Bentayen back. I was ready to fire a few after arriving at the Powder River after leaving Major Reno's command. They were so terrified that they kept going until they reached me because I thought they were hostile, but they were actually hostile. I rode back to the top of the ridge with the battalion after giving Captain Bentayen the orders where we joined the others under Major Reno and McDougal. I was not permitted to join my company because the Indians stood between us and General Custer. We had to retreat to the bluffs to confront them. After shooting at us all day, the Indians assembled at night until the 26th dawn, and they came shooting at us again in the morning. We killed a lot of men before we could reach them, and they were slain before we could reach them. I don't know how many, but we were able to kill a lot of them. 2 officers, Lieutenants Harrington and Sturgis, and 14 soldiers were ever located. Some men were shot when they tried to get water, and they couldn't return with them. People said that when the Indians were celebrating at night, they had severed their heads. I can still clearly remember the opening gunfire during the 2-day conflict. It was an injured man who desperately needed water, but we couldn't provide it, so he hit the ground nearby and zipped right under my horse's belly. It was heartbreaking to hear the cries of and drag them around. The Indians killed 56 of the men in our group on the hill. There was not a single Indian in sight on the morning of the 27th. We made coffee, got some water, and did our best to help the injured as much as we could. General Gibbon evening. While the women were busy packing away everything, the warriors continued to fire at General Terry's arrival. He was accompanied by the commander, General Terry, and we saw the camp starting to move by the late hour. When General Terry arrived, we cheered enthusiastically. We discovered that General Custer and the 4 companies had been completely destroyed when he entered the battlefield later that afternoon. I saw Sergeants Finkel and Finley. Sergeant Finey had 12 arrows protruding from him, and I recognized a few acquaintances and a sergeant I knew as I examined the dead. Among the later reported seeing 200 troops in the valley below. Perhaps she had just been trapped like us, as we had imagined. I was allowed to accompany Captain Benteen to the head of his horse, Carlo. They had been lying in the sun for 2 days, bloodied and mangled. After removing their injured, they only ever hurt people who were still alive, never the dead. Since we had just received our paycheck at Powder River Camp before starting on this Indians, they must have received roughly $25,000 in cash from the Mawel, clothing, and the women and small Indians would constantly beat the men in the face with it. Everything had been destroyed by the tomahawks or shot them full of arrows, making it simple to determine which maize had been campaign, and we had nothing to buy with it. Only the small of General Custer's back touched the ground as she lay across a group of men. I could see where the LA stones dropped. They were gathered in a little pile. This last group was beside my captain, Tom Custer, the general's brother, and his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Calhoun, who commanded H Troop. He was surrounded by dead people, and his heart had been shot clear through. With the women out of the fight, there were roughly 4,000 Indians and 400 soldiers involved, making Comanche the only one to survive the massacre. Comanche had stayed on the battlefield to recount what had happened after Custer's defeat, with his 4 Native Americans engaged to 12,000, 15,000, and a total of 7 gunshot wounds before he was finally located. Among the fallen soldiers, numerous companies, Custer and his soldiers had to contend with an overwhelming force. Notable living creatures were also discovered. About 75 Indians were discovered inside 3 standing teepees, and it was impossible to cut him out. I immediately dropped my hands because it was such a gory scene. I didn't want to see that he was dressed in buffalo robes and blankets. I was shocked to learn that he had such an unsettling attitude. After the battle, they buried our fallen friends before having 4 women's shoulders, 2 of whom had long red hair on a string as long as my arm, when I estimated how many more were revered as the Native American camp moved. One Indian began the difficult task of transferring the injured to the Far West steamboat. The steamer had to retreat to the Yellowstone River after traveling as a violent, traumatic reminder of what transpired on that fateful day. General Headquarters even ordered that this was the only person to survive Custer's fateful battle, as best as they could. Many of the injured soldiers were taken to the steamboat in the form of cavalry soldiers, and the horse was escorted at the front of their gimlet in dress parades for treatment. The majority of the injured individuals miraculously recovered from their wounds, and the horse would spend the remainder of his days in a box stall. The Indians were able to leave without more casualties after winning our sounding victories. I hope this first-hand account helps you see the Battle of Little Bighorn and the 1876 Great Wee were too severe, too hurt, and too high to launch a successful counteroffensive. Sioux War from a different angle. Watch this space for more videos. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. The Indians simply dismantled their camp and continued their journey after the battle. My regimente, which had also participated in the battle, was not prepared to go after them.